Does the word topaz mean anything to you?
What is topaz?
Story of espionage in high places.
I was 28 films into the Alfred Hitchcock collection before I finally saw Topaz. If it hadn't been required for a class, I might never have gotten to it at all. Hitch considered this his weakest film, not on any artistic grounds, but because it lost the most money, and he was always more concerned with reaching an audience than with pleasing critics. But Topaz failed to do either, earning miserable reviews to match its box office and remaining largely written off among film historians as a sign of the master's decline in his later years. Personally, I couldn't disagree more, neither about the film nor the filmmaker. Hitchcock never stopped innovating, and while none of his films after Psycho could be called flawless, this was less the result of an aging artist losing his grip than a studio-era perfectionist adapting to the expanding boundaries of film in the 60s and 70s, no longer able to fall back on the censor baiting or innuendo that had become his stock in trade. His final 6 films are plagued by tonal dissonance, poor casting choices, and some misjudged sexual politics, but they're nevertheless loaded with adventurous camera work and storytelling devices that make this one of the most fascinating phases of his career. And yes, I'm including The Birds in that phase. That's a much weirder movie than people tend to remember. But even to rebrand these films as simply underrated or of interest does a disservice to Topaz, which I'd argue is a minor masterpiece well overdue for reevaluation. And though it too has some glaring problems, I feel like there's one key ingredient that critics have missed which renders all of its flaws insignificant. But let's start from the beginning. What is Topaz? And why did it fail? Released in 1969, Topaz is a Cold War epic based on the best-selling novel of the same name. By most any metric, it's Hitchcock's biggest picture, spanning 5 countries, over 20 major characters, and a runtime that, as Hitch would have put it, exceeds the endurance of the human bladder. The story follows a French spy named André Devereaux as he attempts to procure evidence of a Soviet plot to place nuclear warheads in Cuba. But the film rarely sticks with Devereaux for long, instead switching focus between a series of undercover agents at each new locale. Devereaux will find his contact, relay the next objective, and then they or someone on their team will take over protagonist duties until their portion of the mission is complete, or until they're killed off. It's a highly unique structure that I've never really seen replicated elsewhere. While plenty of films in the heist, war, and escape genres have divided screen time between a dashing leading man and his crack team of specialists, none have passed the point of view baton so often or so gracefully as this one. Each new character truly feels like the hero of their own story, as if the camera might at any moment just decide to follow one of them home instead and abandon Devereaux entirely. And this gives the film a sense of lived-in scope that few epics manage, while also allowing for some of the best standalone set pieces of Hitchcock's career. So it's less Ocean's 11 and more like Winchester 73, an Anthony Mann western about a rifle passed between an ensemble of gunslingers before eventually being returned to its rightful owner. Or for more recent examples, see Steven Spielberg's adaptation of War Horse, or Francois Girard's century-spanning The Red Violin. But these are more like loose anthology films. Every chapter within them has a clear beginning and an end, and though there is an established protagonist, they only serve to bookend the film, and rarely have any relationship to the characters in the middle. Meanwhile, Devereaux pops up all throughout Topaz, often with an intimate connection to the next key player, so we don't usually even realize we've changed perspectives until the next sequence is well underway. A closer comparison might be 101 Dalmatians, which maintains a consistent set of main characters throughout, but reveals midway through that they're connected to an expansive underground network of special agents, each one just as committed to the mission as our leads and just as worthy of the spotlight. But this doesn't quite capture it either, because Disney's film has a fixed breaking point where the universe expands, whereas Hitchcock simply drops us into this structure from the word go. We don't even meet Devereaux until 20 minutes in, so we're never sure what kind of story arc we're watching until the end, or who will be left alive once we get there. We can't assume anyone's safe, and we're forced to project humanity onto even the most minor characters because we don't know who will be important by the next scene. It's basically like watching a full season of Game of Thrones in one sitting. So why didn't this take for audiences in 1969? Well, for a few reasons. One is that they weren't expecting such an extravagant production from a director who, by this point, was scoring his biggest hits with single-location chamber plays and risque thrillers shot on TV budgets. Another is that the spy film itself was in a very different place than it had been just a decade earlier. Hitchcock had spent his career fine-tuning the formula of a common man dropped into the world of espionage, but by the 60s a very uncommon man had taken over the lead role.
Bond. James Bond.
The modern secret agent became an escapist fantasy figure, a globe-trotting, martini-swigging Lothario with little regard for subtlety, and in his wake, serious spy pictures became so hard to swallow that only the grittiest entries saw any real success. Topaz fell right in the middle of these two fields, with genuine weight behind the lives and deaths on screen, but plot contrivances that felt left over from a much sillier script. But the film's main drawback was that it had no bankable American stars. Hitchcock took great advantage of the studio star system throughout his career, casting A-list actors with built-in charisma so he could dive straight into the story without having to burn too much time establishing character. Think your Jimmy Stewarts, your Grace Kellys, your Cary Grants, your Ingrid Bergmans, performers you could introduce just by showing the backs of their heads and still get an instant emotional response. In fact, many of Hitchcock's films from this era are just thinly disguised remakes of previous efforts with the stars he couldn't afford the first time around, and they're generally better for it. Foreign Correspondent is just as strong on paper as North by Northwest, but it's the latter film we remember because Cary Grant straight up wipes the floor with Joel McCrea.
Could you call them and see what they have?
Something wrong with your eye?
Yes, they're sensitive to questions. Will you call them?
Topaz faced a similar problem with Frederick Stafford. As Devereaux, he gives a perfectly serviceable performance, but he doesn't do much to elevate the material and tends to be the least interesting character in any given scene. His wife, his lover, his best friend, his son-in-law all get compelling arcs, but we're never that invested in what happens to him, which makes it something of a letdown that he's the one who brings the story to its conclusion.
You're pretty bad from outside, smash the window.
Hitchcock shot two endings for the film. In the first, Devereaux faces the villain in a duel and wins the day, but test screeners found this preposterous. Despite Hitch's insistence that dueling culture was still alive in France, in fiction it had been relegated mostly to the world of parody.
Sir David, I understand the choice is yours. Sword or pistol?
Sword, as you wish. 'Tis the only weapon for a gentleman.
Just so. That means, Mr. Van Hoyle, that you have the pistol.
I thank you, sir.
In the reshoot, the villain escapes through a web of bureaucratic protection, leaving Devereaux to stand by and watch as his foe flees the country. But this too failed to satisfy, not because it was too bleak, but because we simply don't care enough about Devereaux for him to carry us across the finish line. There ought to be a bittersweet poignancy here about the futility of war, but instead it feels like our hero just kind of gives up on the film. He laughs it off, tells his wife it's fine, and then they get on a plane and fly away. He may as well have looked straight at the camera and said, "Anyway, that's the end of Topaz." I don't want to put all the blame on Stafford here. He's not terrible, and plenty of films have succeeded with far less likable leading men. The problem is that a story with such an elaborate structure needs a strong through line to tie everything together. But I'd argue that Topaz does have that through line. Not in any character, but in a plot device long familiar to any Hitchcock fan. One that's been the subject of intensive study, but somehow always gets overlooked here. Topaz features Hitchcock's all-time greatest MacGuffin. The MacGuffin is a term popularized by Hitchcock to describe an object that drives the plot even though what it is or does has little real significance. It's something terribly important to the characters, but not at all important to the audience, beyond that it moves the story from point A to point B. So buried treasure is a MacGuffin, magical talismans are MacGuffins, just about any murder weapon or incriminating clue is a MacGuffin, so long as it's made clear that the characters want to get it or get rid of it. Hitch liked to describe the trope using this joke about two men on a train.
And one man says to the other opposite him, he said, "What's that package above your head there?" And the other man said, "Oh, that's a MacGuffin." He said, "Well, what is a MacGuffin?" He said, "Well, it's an apparatus for trapping lions in the Scottish Highlands." The man said, but there are no lions in the Scottish Highlands. He said, then that's no MacGuffin.
I don't really get this joke. But basically what it means is that a MacGuffin may as well be nothing at all. Nothing at all! Nothing at all! You could swap it out for any other item with the same approximate dimensions and it wouldn't change the story in the slightest. Nor does it need to be a physical object. It can be a piece of music, a mathematical formula, a tennis match, or even a person.
Why should we care if some foreign statesman we'd never even heard of were assassinated?
Tell me, in June 1914, had you ever heard of a place called Sarajevo? Of course you hadn't. I doubt if you'd even heard of the Archduke Ferdinand. But in a month's time, because a man you'd never heard of killed another man you'd never heard of, in a place you'd never heard of, this country was at war.
In The Man Who Knew Too Much, we're told that a man's life will depend upon a clash of cymbals, but the MacGuffin is neither the cymbals nor the song they play in, but the man himself. A foreign prime minister whose assassination we're told may lead to war, but who could just as easily be the Crown Prince of Milwaukee for all we care, so long as we believe that the characters have to save him. So if we're looking at Topaz, you could say that the MacGuffin is the proof of the missiles in Cuba, but that proof takes many different forms as it changes hands. In one scene, it's a briefcase, then a camera, then a sandwich, then a set of razor blades.
Razor blades?
But without any single concrete item of importance throughout the film, we can't really rely on this vague idea of a MacGuffin to carry the momentum. There's never a sense that all will be lost if any given object is compromised. More just that we'll have to go back to the last checkpoint and try again with a new character. And since we have an endless supply of characters from which to choose, there must be some other unifying element to maintain the stakes. Other films in the Topaz mold have understood the importance of a clear and consistent MacGuffin. Winchester 73 has the Winchester, Red Violin has the violin, Warhorse has the Warhorse, 101 Dalmatians has 99 of the Dalmatians, but there's no Topaz in Topaz. The title refers only to a codename, not some actual gem that everyone wants to get their hands on. So what's our MacGuffin? What object or idea drives each new sequence despite having no real significance of its own? What's the one thing that's of great importance to every character, but that we, the audience, never really care about at all? It's Andre Devereaux. Hitchcock clearly doesn't value Devereaux as a character, which is probably why he cast an unknown like Stafford in the first place. It's not just that he's dull, it's that he's omitted from the action anytime things start to get interesting. Even plotlines in which he's directly involved push him off screen just before they hit their emotional peak, or stage him like a piece of furniture so he draws as little attention as possible. Look at the scene where he delegates an assignment to Philippe Dubois, a former associate and the first of many spies who will far outshine him. Now in another film, these two would exchange a few jokes, talk about the old days, give us a general idea of what relationship they share. But here's what this scene sounds like in Topaz. Nothing. We're cut clean out of this conversation, because we don't need to know how Dubois feels about Devereaux, because Devereaux isn't the protagonist. He's a MacGuffin. No matter what personality or backstory you give him, this scene plays exactly the same way. And we see him sidelined like this again and again throughout the film. Here's how a normal movie would show a scene between two romantic leads, parting for what they know will be the last time.
He's looking at you, kid.
And here's how you show that same scene when one of your characters is a MacGuffin. Here's how your typical leading man smuggles contraband out of a foreign country. And here's what you see when your leading man is a MacGuffin.
Guerrero, what do you mean you have to let him go?
All right. All right. They let him go.
Here's how the hero reacts when he finds out his lover has been murdered. And here's how a MacGuffin responds. None of this is accidental. Devereaux has to be a blank slate or we wouldn't be able to detach ourselves from his point of view, at least not nearly so often as the film demands. We could take an occasional detour with a supporting player, but we'd always be anchored to the main story, wondering in the back of our minds when our hero will return. But Topaz cuts us loose at every opportunity, sending us headfirst into one narrative arc after another and giving each one the full emotional weight that most films would reserve for the protagonist.
He will not give you an interview.
Then I failed. But I'm not going to fail in your bathroom. Come on.
The Great Escape has plenty of memorable scenes and characters, but when I try to remember how it makes me feel, all that comes to mind is Steve McQueen shredding those hills. But when I think about how Topaz feels, my mind is flooded with valiant heroes, noble sacrifices, and heartbreaking betrayals.
What is it?
Well, to be honest, I've been shocked, just a little.
I think about this haunting Pieta silhouette, this dress spilling onto the floor like a pool of blood, this stakeout being compromised, and a cheeky little nod to the birds. I think about a bottomless well of characters given more depth in 5 minutes than most films manage in an entire runtime. Some young, some old, some good, some evil, some subject to regrettable whitewashing, but others among the best characters of color in Hitchcock's entire filmography, all tied together in service of a cause they know to be bigger than themselves. The only thing I don't think about is Devereaux. The secret to enjoying this film is to treat him like you would any other MacGuffin. Let him take you from one story beat to the next, and then forget about him as quickly as possible.
The point is, you see, that while I have learned over the years that the MacGuffin is nothing, I find it very hard to convince other people.
Bien que j'ai appris moi-même, je trouve que c'est très difficile de convaincre les autres de ceci.
C'est ça.
That's true.
Oui, mais ce qu'il faut aussi, c'est que non seulement il est rien, mais qu'on l'oublie même en cours de route.
But it's also true that, well, it's nothing. It's also necessary to forget it, well, as the picture progresses.
After neither ending was deemed acceptable, Hitchcock cut together a third conclusion for the film's release. This time, the villain realizes he's been beat, returns home, and commits suicide. A gunshot rings out from his door and music plays over a brief montage of characters who were killed throughout the story. It's painfully obvious that this sequence was cobbled together from existing footage, not least of all because this isn't the villain. It's a different character who's 50 pounds heavier and walks with a cane, which even this awkwardly quick shot of him fails to hide. But as cheap as this ending feels, I think it's the most satisfying of the three, because it's the only one that pulls the focus away from Devereaux and back to the ensemble where it belongs. Audiences dismiss Topaz because they took it as less than the sum of its parts, but the film is the parts. It's scene after scene of top-tier Hitchcock material, and emphatic proof that the master of suspense never lost his touch. I hope I've convinced at least a few of you to check it out, or to give it a second chance if you didn't like it the first time. And whichever ending you watch, just try to remember that this story doesn't belong to the MacGuffin. It belongs to the many worthy heroes whose paths he crosses along the way. So long as these are the characters on your mind when the credits roll, you won't leave disappointed. After all, here's how powerful an ending can be through the eyes of the hero.
Forget it, Jake. It's Chinatown.
And here's pretty much the best you're gonna get with a MacGuffin.
Anyway, that's the end of Topaz.